In 1980 and 1981, Eddie Johnson was the starting point guard for the Eastern Conference All-Stars, and the world was at his fingertips. With his blazing speed and poise as a floor general, it seemed the spotlight was always on Eddie Johnson, and indeed he shined. However, in what would become one of the craziest stories the NBA has ever seen, Eddie Johnson's life would spiral, as shown when in the summer of 1980, drug dealers would break into Eddie Johnson's apartment and shoot at him. And in order to escape, Johnson had to jump out his second-story window. Something that sounds insane, but as you watch the rest of this video on a story where the end result lands Eddie Johnson in prison for life, you'll soon realize that jumping out of a second-story window was just another crazy story in one of the craziest lives the NBA has ever seen. And so what's up guys, Mike here, and that is the topic of today's video. And I really don't want to downplay things here because this is actually one of the darkest stories the NBA has ever seen. Because Eddie Johnson was once an NBA All-Star starter and now he is in prison for life. So in this video, we are going to look at what happened to Eddie Johnson, why is he in prison for life? And so with that said, let's jump into this. Eddie Johnson was always talented at basketball, there is no question about that. And because Eddie excelled in high school, he would go on to play at the University of Auburn, where he averaged nearly 20 points per game. He did this even though his head coach at the time, Bob Davis, said that Eddie did not want to play and had a bad attitude. However, despite low expectations, Eddie Johnson would quickly find success on the Atlanta Hawks. And so now we are fast forwarding, and here we are at the 1980 NBA All-Star. It is here that Eddie Johnson has shockingly, despite his bad attitude, become one of the best players in the entire league. Because in 1980, he was named an All-Star starter next to Julius Erving and was even named a starter over Larry Bird. In fact, Eddie would actually be one of the better players in the 1980 All-Star game, as he led the Eastern Conference to a win with 22 points, 7 assists, and 6 steals. And if it were not for George Gervin scoring 34 points, Eddie Johnson probably would have been the All-Star game MVP. So yes, Johnson was for sure one of the best talents in the entire NBA in the early 1980s, but looking beyond that, finally we are going to look at where the real story begins. Because early on in his NBA career, the Atlanta Hawks noticed that Eddie's entourage was filled with a lot of shady characters. As per usual in the 1980s for the NBA, Eddie Johnson would begin to use cocaine, and it was because of this drug use that his head coach Hubie Brown would bluntly state he has the tools to be one of the greatest players in the league. The only person standing in his way is Eddie Johnson. And as it turns out, Eddie Johnson would just never move out of his own way. Because now, looking at the summer of 1980, we have again a couple of drug dealers breaking into the apartment of Eddie Johnson, and this is when they began shooting at him. And again, to escape, Johnson had to jump out of a second-story window. And as it turns out, the guy who shot at Johnson was a pimp who told detectives that Eddie beat up a woman who delivered drugs to him, which is why the shooters retaliated. Then, 3 weeks later, Johnson was arrested for cocaine possession. However, he also would deny he had a drug problem, stating at the time, "No, I don't. I'm covered. You all think athletes use drugs, that's society." With this statement in mind, and with the fact that he was a rich NBA player in mind, Eddie was then arrested for stealing a Porsche from a car dealership. In the words of Eddie Johnson, "The guy thought I was going to buy a car. He let me test drive it, and I stayed a little longer than usual." In other words, Eddie test drove a car and then stole it, and it was around this time that during training camp for the Hawks, Johnson would tell the press that he was getting traded to the Showtime Lakers. However, this would never happen as Eddie's erratic behavior would continue. The end result here was Eddie Johnson being dragged off the floor by 2 policemen during an NBA practice and involuntarily being committed to a mental hospital. Despite this, somehow Johnson would bounce back at least place on the floor. He would make the All-Star game again in 1981 and again was a starter. However, throughout the rest of his playing career, Johnson would remain in news headlines, but for the wrong reasons. Eddie's last season in the NBA was with the Seattle Supersonics, and at this point, he had become a shell of the player he had once been. And it was also at this point where things somehow turned even worse, as you are about to hear one of the ugliest stories the NBA has ever seen. Because you see, being in the NBA gave Eddie a sense of stability that he quite simply did not have once retirement came knocking at his door. Which meant in 1987, Eddie Johnson would be arrested for attempting to sell $20 worth of crack cocaine to an undercover police officer. It was also during this time that the NBA would ban him for life. In this same year of 1987, Eddie was also arrested in Atlanta for passing a bad check, aggravated assault, theft, battery, and abandonment of a child. Then, in August of 1989, he was arrested for breaking into 2 houses. There was also the one time where Eddie Johnson punched an officer in the face several times, another where Eddie would steal $98 worth of clothes from Target, and the list really goes on here. Eventually, Eddie would somehow rack up over 100 arrests, and I think everyone at this point watching this video has gotten the point. I mean, 100 arrests? That number seems improbable, but somehow Eddie Johnson managed to do it. Now, looking at this situation, it was clear that Eddie Johnson had several mental problems and drug issues and needed help, but unfortunately, it is at this point where this story turns even worse, because Eddie was arrested for breaking into a hotel room and a 25-year-old woman. Now, in this case, that word does have to be removed because of YouTube's guidelines. However, I didn't want to downplay the word and make it seem like he did less than he did, and I think many of you know what I am alluding to. With this in mind, somehow, despite having over 100 arrests, Eddie was let go on bond and was allowed to wait for his trial outside of jail. Then, not even 2 months later, he was arrested for again. For this crime, it was reported he broke into an apartment and an 8-year-old. This is horrible, disgusting, reprehensible. It is possibly the worst crime an NBA player has ever been accused of. I think you can tell by my tone of voice exactly what I think of this man. To make things even worse though here, unfortunately, a lot of you guys may know that there was another NBA player named Eddie Johnson who was not a criminal, and unfortunately, multiple national news outlets reported that it was that Eddie Johnson who was the one who was causing this trouble. This led to his professional career almost being ruined as he was bombarded by hate mail and death threats, but luckily things would eventually cool over for the innocent Eddie Johnson. As for the criminal lowlife Eddie Johnson, in 2008 he would be found guilty of all charges, and yes, he was sentenced to life in prison. And so here we are. Eddie Johnson was once a man who had it all, was once a player who was starting in an all-star game that featured Magic Johnson, Larry Bird, and Julius Erving. In terms of just pure talent, Eddie Johnson should have had a long and incredible NBA career, but because he's a horrible person, Eddie Johnson now sits in a Florida prison cell for the rest of his life. So there we have it, guys. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed. This was definitely a touchy subject matter, and I just want to say to all of Eddie Johnson's victims, I am just horribly, horribly sorry. No one should have to go through that. Again, I think you guys can tell from this video what my opinion is on Eddie Johnson, just what a horrible person, and that's putting it lightly. I'm not going to ask for likes in this video. I'm not going to ask to subscribe, but I do want to say to everyone who is subscribed, to everyone who is supporting, thank you so much. You're awesome. We all know it. And as always, have an awesome day and cue that.